right, our first speaker today is Laura de Lozier, the adapter and producer of the 2021 Zoom production of Aristophanes' Wasps by the Relative Theatrics Company, with original music composed by Noelia Burks and arranged by Tammy Lipstew. She is the only classicist in the University of Wyoming, and there enjoys exploring with students the languages and cultures of Greeks and Romans. She's particularly interested in reception, performance, and outreach to the community. So, welcome, Laura.
Thank you. I'm gonna screen share. There we go. So my paper was about the production I did of Aristophanes' Wasps with Relative Theatrics and Western Nebraska Community College, my two external partners. And it focused on casting decisions, two casting decisions that were made, which I think ended up queering Aristophanes' Wasps. So I began the paper by talking about the pedagogical benefits of this experience. They included allowing students in my Athenian democracy class, as well as other students in the classics and Latin programs, as well as members of the community, to actually experience Aristophanes as a performance and not just having to read a text. And we have created an open educational resource. The video is still available at Relative Theatrics YouTube page, as you see here. The students in the theater program at Western Nebraska Community College also got an additional experience of experiential learning. They had to audition to be members of the cast as well as members of the production team. And there they got to work with professional actors, including some who are equity actors. The two casting decisions that we made that I discuss in this paper are first gender bent casting. That was our director's decision. And it resulted in female bodies, default bodies, performing what in the original text are male bodies of citizens, such as the father and son, Philocleon and Bedeli-Cleon, as well as for us, we chose to have a 3-member chorus. We had the two adult members of the chorus, a chorus leader, a chorus member, and we also had a child of a chorus member. We then had male default bodies performing the subalterns. They include Xanthias, Socius, 2 slaves, ostensibly owned by Bedeli-Cleon at the play's beginning, though you can question whether at one time they were actually Philocleon's property, as well as Dardanus, who in the original is a female hired piper for a symposium. These decisions were coupled with a second decision, which was mine, which is that I wished for more age-appropriate casting. The initial inclination of the director and the producing artistic director were to go for 40 to 50-year-old default bodies to be playing the father and the chorus members who were the adults. But I felt that these characters' most salient feature was their age. They have been veterans of the Greco-Persian Wars. They are roughly 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds, and 90-year-olds, depending on how old they were in which campaign they fought in during those conflicts. And if their default bodies were younger, it would result perhaps in more questioning about the importance of jury duty in their lives as older citizens of the polis of Athens. They have gone from being veterans where they had meaning and identity in service, and they are now reliant on jury service as a transition in their life when they can no longer actively serve in the military and also reliant on it for income, at least as the chorus leader describes being in a situation we might call food insecurity. So the result of gender-bent casting and more age-appropriate casting for the default bodies resulted in some interesting interpretations that I tried to understand after the performance. when we get to a scene in the play where Bedelic encourages his father to accept lockdown in their house by giving him an opportunity to judge a trial. It's a trial of two dogs over one dog having stolen a big cheese. And the witnesses are, in addition to the puppies here coming in, are other utensils in the household. And one of the members in our community who watched the performance and participated in the community discussion afterwards interpreted this entire sequence as a sign of Philip Cleon's dementia. And that really threw me for a loop because no one in the production team had talked about this scene in that factor. We were taking it as more a surreal event, part of the humor of Aristophanes. And so I was trying to understand what could have led that member of our community to interpret it. And that is where I turned then to looking at research on ageism and the association between dementia and females, that the majority, that females are twice as likely as males to experience dementia, in part because females tend to live longer than males in industrialized communities. And that coupled with the default bodies having been chosen to be more in keeping with the age of the characters, at least as being young, old, and maybe middle old. We did not have any actors actually playing old, which would be someone who is 85 or older. That these two decisions had come together for that person to look at Philip Cleon as a woman experiencing dementia, and that the son is humoring the psychosis. The second scene I looked at in my paper is at the end where Philip Cleon has gone to the symposium with Bedelic Cleon and has stolen away the piper. And in the Greek text, when I was retranslating for the adaptation, the bit that goes between the orange and the red to me was a very frightening moment to translate because it seemed to indicate we were teetering at a moment of a sexual assault. There is a potential threat of physical violence from Philip Cleon. But if you choose to have a default body as represented by our Philip Cleon, and this default body that you're seeing for our Dardanus, the girl Piper, it changes the way the audience can react to the scene, in that ultimately it is harder to imagine a threat of physical violence from Philip Cleon. And instead, Dardanus seems to have more control in the situation. And it completely shifts how you are perceiving it. But it also it concords with research about dementia, which indicates that 7 to 25% of individuals who experience dementia will also exhibit hypersexuality. And that for females, this is characterized by verbal hypersexuality, while males are characterized as physical actions. And so again, that audience member who was watching our performance with a gender bent cast and with more age appropriate casting may have been supported in their interpretation of Philip Cleon as experiencing dementia by looking at these two scenes with the default bodies we had chosen. And then these were the sources I mentioned that I cited in the paper. So thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, moving on to our next paper and onto YouTube. This paper is by Tristan Johnson. He is currently a graduate student with the Department of Communication at St. Louis University in St. Louis. He's particularly interested in political communication as a background in communication studies and how the receptions, representations of the ancient classics, and particularly those we'll see of ancient Egypt, can be used to create political and social narratives through mass media. All right, off to you, Tristan.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here before I get started. So my paper is titled Orientalism Through Social Media, Does Modern YouTube Present Accuracy with the Reception of Ancient Egypt? I am one for long titles. So why is this important to study now? YouTube is one of the most popular media platforms. And unfortunately, with the pandemic we are still in, this has led to a lot of people, whether that be through homeschooling or just wanting to learn on their own, turning to YouTube to access information. It can be used for supplemental educational activities, but on the opposite side of this, social media is full of misinformation. For the study of ancient Egypt, Egypt has always fascinated the West for as long as they've known about Egypt. That is kind of what Egyptomania talks about. We've had discussions outside of social media and the everyday about Orientalism and how the study of ancient Egypt, specifically within Egyptology, is fraught with racism, Orientalism, all of that fun stuff. The exclusion from classics, and the goal with this paper is to talk about the importance of decentralizing an Orientalist mindset. Orientalism, what I'm looking at here is basically the fact that Hollywood and the media vilifies cultures of the Middle East. I do this through the framework of Edward Said's Orientalism. Basically, media that shows us ancient Egypt creates an us versus them or a West versus East dichotomy. So when I was doing this, my research question was very simple. What information does YouTube provide to mass audiences about ancient Egypt? I did this through a narrative analysis of the top 25 most viewed YouTube videos by searching for ancient Egypt. And then I also did a quantitative content analysis because I do think both of these methods provide some interesting insights. So lots of words here. I'm not going to read these to you, but what you should know that the top 25 videos, most popular, most viewed videos on YouTube about ancient Egypt have been viewed over 420 million times. So I think it is safe to say that people are turning to YouTube to learn about ancient Egypt and the history of it. Average views around 17 million per video. So just very quickly by the numbers, most of them were documentary and documentary style. But what I found most interesting is the popular list category. That's what I describe and others have described as the thing you would share on Facebook or other social media platforms. So like the top 10 ghost stories in history, that kind of thing. Not to give you whiplash, but I don't want to spend the remainder of my time talking about all of these. But here are the different titles for documentary, popular lists, music. The #1 most viewed video on YouTube that has to deal with ancient Egypt is the Bengals Walk Like an Egyptian. So there you have it. We have children's animation, we have video games, we have film commercials, and we have just general news. I'm not going to play a video. If you would like to watch it, I'm sure you can watch it at another time if you haven't yet, but it centers around how the pyramids were built by aliens, and it has over a 21 million view count, making it one of the most popular videos. What do these videos actually say, and what is important to take away from this? Titles matter. This is what's contributing to our othering process. So with titles like 14 Strange Ways of Life the Ancient Egyptians Encountered, or 10 Secrets of Ancient Egypt, creating that mystery has contributed to the othering that we have today of the Middle East, between the East and the West. Sources matter. Most of them were not credible sources because, again, anyone can go on YouTube and upload content. This has contributed to othering, and of course, ancient Egypt content is filled with conspiracies. One thing I did find interesting, and a conclusion I'd like to make, is that Egypt has been used as a tool to gain views, even with the content having nothing to do with Egypt at all, just because, like I said earlier, we've been very fascinated with what ancient Egypt is throughout history. Some final conclusions in the few seconds I have left of my 5 minutes. Media literacy is important. Therefore, it's important to understand where we are learning about history and what content we are consuming because factual information is necessary for combating Orientalism and not looking at conspiracy videos. And it's important to challenge these. And finally, YouTube is not a safe site to consume ancient Egyptian content if people would like to learn about history. So that is a quick 5-minute summary of what my paper was and presentation was.
Thank you so much, Tristan. All right, our last speaker for today, we've been moving eastward geographically over the course of this panel, I think probably coincidentally, but we move now to Ronnie Ancona, Professor of Classics at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of CUNY. Ronnie is the author of Time and the Erotic in Horace's Odes, and other numerous works on Horace and Catullus and Latin love poetry, and in particular is well known to many of us as the editor of a variety of textbooks, including the 19-volume BC Latin Reader series from Boccasi Carducci Publishers, and most recently edited New Directions in the Study of Women in the Greco-Roman World. Her next book project is going a slightly different direction, focusing on Martha Graham's Greek myth-based dances and her collaboration with the sculptor and set designer Isamu Noguchi, which is, I presume, where this particular paper presentation is drawn from. And if you want to read more about that, her piece on Graham's Cave of the Heart appeared in 2020 in New Voices in Classical Reception Studies. Thank you, Ronnie. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here today. The title of my presentation is Now Via Patreon, a reception of a reception, the Jocasta-centered night journey with annotation by Martha Graham. And I thought I would take my 5 minutes to contextualize the presentation that I contributed to the conference, which you may or may not have seen already in these busy times. As Anise said, I'm currently working on a book under contract with Bloomsbury on Martha Graham's Greek myth-based dances and her collaboration with Isamu Noguchi. For those of you not familiar with Graham and Noguchi, they were both major figures in the arts, Graham in modern dance and Noguchi in sculpture and design in the 20th century. The two worked together for decades, and Graham's Greek myth-based dances incorporate sets designed by Noguchi. My impulse to share some of this work in progress at the Ames conference emerged from my continuing to do research through the pandemic as best I could. The Martha Graham Company, like many arts organizations, responded to the pandemic by trying to reach out to audiences virtually. They began with some free programming, the Martha, as in Martha Graham, matinees, that later moved to a hybrid format, which provided paid programming for viewing in full, along with free snippets to be shared on their YouTube channel. At fairly low cost, one can partake of the paid resources through various levels of Patreon subscriptions. Such income could help to set off, in part, maybe small part, major losses from pandemic-canceled performances. One of the pieces I write about in my book is Martha Graham's Night Journey from 1947, a woman-centered version of the Oedipus story, best known from Sophocles' play, that shifts the focus more to Jocasta. Noguchi designed a bed for the set that plays a major role in the dance in various ways, including by foregrounding the issue of desire. Janet Elber, artistic director of the company, created during the pandemic an annotated video version of the dance, pulling quotes from Graham about Night Journey and superimposing them on a 2016 production of the dance. A short clip of this is freely available to be enjoyed for its own sake or shared with students in the context of classical reception, among other contexts. I saw the entire production through Patreon and found interesting the continual reworking of the piece. 1947 premiere, 2016 production, current edition of verbal transcript, not unlike closed captioning, as an example of how reception can be an ongoing process in the performance arts. So let me show you the 1-minute clip that's freely available, and then I look forward to any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. All right, so we have 3 papers which are both individually fascinating and engage with each other in different ways. And I now like to open the floor to questions. Again, please send them to me, Anise Strong, in chat, and I will pass them on to everyone. I want to start off with a question that Natalie Swain originally directed for Tristan, but is actually part of, I think, a larger question that unites these 3 papers together, which is that very frequently, both in scholarship and I think just in popular culture, we are told to fear and hate the comments section. And I'm curious about, for all 3 of these works that you're commenting on and so forth, how you've considered the comments section and the way in which the comments section provides interactivity and commentary on the work itself, and in a perhaps sort of ongoing way rather than in a fixed way, and so on. So we might start off with Tristan for that, and Natalie was also particularly interested in how you found that viewers were engaging with the videos and if there was any awareness of Orientalization. But I'd also be very interested to hear Ronnie and Laura's perspectives on the comment section, as it were.
Yeah. Oh, did I unmute myself? Yes, I did. For the purposes of this paper, I didn't look at comment sections. I think that deserves its own separate examination, because if looking at the different videos, if you have, as a side note, within the past week, YouTube has disabled dislikes. So now you're just turning to comments to see if this video is accurate or not. So if it does show an accurate representation, the top half of comments are all agreeing with it, and then the bottom half are the ones saying, oh, this is wrong, Egypt was built by aliens. And then if you look at videos with conspiracy theories, the top half are, yeah, I believe this is correct. And then the bottom half are, you should go to school or read a book or learn something. So it's pretty mixed for both. And I don't know how to explain why. I think it's just people going with their confirmation bias of what they already believe, but then disagreeing.
That makes sense. Ronnie or Laura, you want to speak about?
Well, right now our video online only has 1 comment where the person was positive. So for me, the comments were a live set of comments that either came through people who felt comfortable turning on their camera, and that's usually the least amount of the people of my community who engage in these productions. We get far more comments that come in from folks who are either okay turning on their camera when we are having the discussion. And we made, Relative Theatrics and I have been doing virtual events since April 2020 because of the pandemic. And we initially recorded our community discussions, but we made a choice not to as we were approaching the new school year because we suspected it was limiting who wished to speak and who wished to be preserved with certain comments online. So you cannot see our community discussion. That is not what you'll find when you go to the link that is on the video. So we have people who are willing to comment and chat, or to at least have their camera on and comment and chat. And that is where this journey for me began, was by having a response from someone that I just didn't understand, frankly. And that at first I interpreted as, that person doesn't understand that text. And since that person was my student, I was even more surprised. I was like, but wait, we've had this discussion. What aren't you getting? And then I thought, no, why does that? Because I know that student. That student has been in multiple classes of mine. So I was very curious what might have interpreted, what would have led to that interpretation. And so for me, the community discussion is an opportunity for public scholarship to occur for people. Our audience is, yes, largely up and down the Front Range here, so in the Mountain Time Zone. But we do have people who join in, particularly if they are related to members of the cast or related to someone in the production. And it is a nice opportunity to have different viewpoints be expressed, to see what resonates, because it can be so surprisingly not what you thought was going to resonate. And that is always useful for me as someone at a land-grant university who wants to justify to the taxpayers of Wyoming what I'm doing with the money they graciously provide me to do things. And it is useful also to see what has meaning still in this text for someone living today. And I'm always surprised and delighted when people make comments in the public about, I can't believe they still had fill in the blank this problem back then. And so they see that connection. And so for me, that's what I most enjoy about community discussions, is when people draw those connections.
Makes sense. And I think there's interesting contrast then between that kind of audience in rural Wyoming and so forth, and going over to Ronnie, where I have to assume that the audience who subscribes to the page of the Martha Graham Dance Company is, is it your sense or impression that it generally skews more elite or urban?
Well, that's a good question. First, apologies if you didn't hear the music when I showed the brief clip. If you go into my actual presentation, you will hear it. So my error there. Yeah, this is a great question. I'm going to answer in terms of the chat, which is enabled for those people initially watching for free and now just through Patreon. It's a wonderfully democratic chat in which people of all roles, just casual viewer who decided to subscribe, artistic director of the company, someone who played Jocasta 20 years ago, it could be anybody, is busily conversing in the chat. And I found that very exciting, particularly as someone researching in this area. I had dealt with the Martha Graham Company initially right before we went into seclusion, or whatever you want to call it. So I knew those people, by name, but dancers from the past, audience members from the past, all chatting away, asking each other questions, and getting wonderful responses. So I think that the chat feature is a wonderful addition in this particular niche of the arts world that I was participating in.
Makes sense. All right, back to Tristan, continuing on this theme of audience. A question from Jacqueline Neal. A story of NPR was noting that a large number of African-American families have chosen homeschooling, not just due to the pandemic, but also due to the recent school board fights and so forth, debates over critical race theory. Have you noticed any depictions of Egypt that seem to specifically speak to African-American audiences?
I have, not in this paper. I think I would have to go further than the most popular videos to find that, which in and of itself is its own conundrum. What I will say, there are a lot of YouTube and general social media content out there arguing about what race or ethnicity the ancient Egyptians were. And that is a very complicated conversation depending on who you're talking to. So I think there is some content out there regarding that, but that is a very timely conversation to be had, especially with Egypt being used as a tool to either fit an agenda or deny someone's agenda. So I do think that is worth looking into more.
And certainly the ancient aliens aspect and Orientalism also play into that. While we have you and so forth, one quick question there from Ronnie, actually, like the clip about aliens, which is that intended as purely humor rather than as fact, or what's the effect, however, it being one of the 25 most popular videos if it's presented as humor?
You know, I would hope for it to be humor, but the fact that it comes up so frequently and in so many different discussions about ancient Egypt, it's not humorous anymore. I think if you disagree with the idea that aliens built the ancient Egyptian societies and pyramids, you might easily take it as a joke. But if you go into these conspiracy communities, and again, it is a conspiracy, but a lot of people believe that this actually to be true. And with the last question I had about catering to African history and more homeschooling going on, it brings up the conversation that it's easier for some people to believe that aliens built something so giant and so great than it is for them to believe that communities of color built these places. So I do think it's oriented in a lot of racist tendencies, but again, the history of ancient Egypt is often just used as an agenda for various cultures and communities throughout history.
As has been clear from Elon Musk's comments about it this week, unfortunately. All right. Yes, and Meredith Safran wants to point out that Ekaterine Boot's presentation from yesterday morning on Soviet science is also really valuable for people interested in the impact of the ancient aliens theory, in quotation marks. I'm not sure it rises to the level of theory. All right, back to Laura. Question actually from Tristan. What have you learned from this production, and do you have advice or tips for people wanting to do something like this in the future? Back over to our pedagogical questions.
Well, I if you can, I would encourage to try. It depends how much you want to do. I did not realize when I took this on, I was going to be translating out the play in a month. So that part, I don't recommend trying. But I give yourself plenty of time, and finding external partners with whom you can work is a wonderful joy to present and perform text to your students. This would have been an in-person event had there not been the pandemic. But as a virtual event, the benefit was it freed us to access actors who were known to our director, who were around the country and who were willing to take on this kind of assignment, I'd say the number one thing is be prepared to pay people something that is commensurate with the amount of time you're going to ask for them. So that was one of my concerns, was able to go out and get sufficient funds to pay them. Now, you're talking just 3 figures for an actor for this situation where you're going to have 3 major and potentially 6 voice rehearsals on top. So if people doing the singing will have maybe up to 9 meetings and so forth. And so you try to make sure that you can compensate people for their time. And I guess the other thing is to you come in with your ideas, but you must be prepared to listen, because someone's likely to have a better idea than you. And I think, and then just go with it and see where it is. However, if there is something that you really do feel convinced about, you can hold on that one position. So it's a collaborative process, right? And you pick your battles of what you want to do, and appreciate that opportunity of also learning how much you can or can't do. So for example, if you were going to go with, we mused about different kinds of decisions. Say, are we going to have political masks for the 2 dog scene? Because traditionally that's understood as it's to be a political rivalry between the 2 generals, and the dogs would be wearing masks to represent the 2 Athenian generals. So we went through a slew of, did you want male versus female? Did you want 2 females that would be well known? And in the end, I think because of the exhaustion of certain political rhetoric, we just decided to go apolitical on choosing the masks. And that's something which, when we began the process, we didn't realize we were going to go to, but you respond to what's happening at that moment and are prepared to change your ideas.
That makes a lot of sense. Oh, and you talk about funding. Do you get funding from your university for this, or from external sources, or?
The principal amount of funding came from the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Wyoming, who graciously awarded me a research and creative activities grant. So that was a wonderful thing. I applied for that and got. The secondary source of funding was actually from Western Nebraska Community College. As they came more and more into our partnership, more opportunities, what we could do with them. Their theater program was able to also offer a bit of funding, and there was some funding also from my department, but that other external partner and my own college and the university provided the bulk of the funding.
That's great. Other questions that people have? I think I know I have several, but I want to hear from other voices we haven't had a chance to hear from yet. Question that I had for Ronnie here. One of the things that your presentation talks about is the question of what the effect of this annotation is. And I found myself that when I was watching the clip that I was distracted by the text from the dance, the movement. And I'm curious as to, it's a very interesting way to tell the story and so forth, but to what extent you think that is, that extra layer is removing a focus on the dance and sort of the pros and cons of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and there's going to be a different answer for anyone watching it. I think in terms of broadening the audience for dance, having some kind of commentary, particularly by the choreographer, although that's not a totally reliable source on anything either, can make some of this work more approachable. I mean, it's not unlike, I don't know what their current practice is, but I remember when the Metropolitan Opera in New York would be presenting operas in the original language and finally had I think it was the Met, not the City Opera, but correct me if I'm wrong. Then they ended up adding some superscripts. So, it was fairly far away from the stage above, so you could kind of ignore it, but, it was there. And again, that was a long time ago, and I think it was to attract a wider audience. It's difficult for some people to engage with nonverbal art. And obviously performing arts and visual arts, much of it will be nonverbal. And that's a great thing and an interesting thing. And yet I think the commentary can be a way of bringing people more into the dance. So I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think it's a great experimental kind of activity, particularly in the virtual, more public context.
A question for Tristan from Laura. Students often express surprise about what ancient peoples can build. Are there theoretical perspectives that explain why post-industrial people doubt their human ancestors' ability to build impressive monuments? And I would sort of add to that, and how does that contrast with the whole lost golden ages theme that we also see in various, everything from Gibbon on down?
I think it's just, I'm not an Egyptology person. I'm more media studies-esque, so I don't know if there's specific theories in Egyptology that explains that. But in media, I think it's just with the way our current political systems are and viewing the Middle East as, a political enemy, but also we need the Middle East for, anyway, whole different conversations of politics. But I think that it has to do with a lot of that fear of othering that I have spoken about in my presentation and paper. I think it's a lot of contextual factors of long history of racism and fighting and wars and things like that. And I think it's just with the way we view the modern Middle East now, how could we, and again, I'm speaking for someone else, not myself, how can we think of Egypt and the Middle East at once being great? That kind of thing. So there's a lot of political issues and racial issues at hand there with that type of conversation.
That makes sense. Sort of another question there, and drawing on your background in media studies, looking sort of proactively, how do we as more knowledgeable scholars, or how to promote the kinds of videos that we would like to see start going up in the top 25 videos about ancient Egypt and so forth? How do we create that attractive content, given that, as you say, given the current landscape and so forth, the conspiracy theories and so forth seem to be dominating over the truth? And ideally, how do we promote attractive content that is by a wider variety of voices, including in this case, perhaps particular actual Egyptian voices?
So I don't see this being fixed anytime soon, just as from my pessimistic viewpoint of the way the media and the world works. But I think encouraging Egyptian voices to create Egyptian content and having non-Egyptian people kind of step back and make room for those voices to share their history rather than someone else coming in and telling their history. I think that would help. And then I also just think creating content that sort of re-educates people on different conspiracy theories of ancient Egypt, because there are a lot of different viewpoints of what actually happened. And again, with it being so long ago, some of these theories may hold true. I don't want to say that, but I think counteracting those conspiracies will be super helpful, creating content that counteracts it, encouraging Egyptian voices. And then also I had another thought, but it's gone. I don't know where it went.
Well,
I think Yeah, it's gone.
If it comes
Bye-bye.
back, feel free to jump in. Question from Andrea Els for Ronnie. What does it mean here that Martha Graham, as the choreographer, is commenting on her own work? That is to say, thinking about that as reception, which you talk a little bit about in your presentation, but expanding. That is it the same reception as the dance, or is it a radically different kind of reception?
Yeah, this is a great question, and the answer would be a long and somewhat complicated one if we had more time. First, I suggested this before, that an artist writing about their own work is not necessarily the most reliable guide. I mean, that's true in literature, the arts, etc. An additional complication is that some recent work, scholarly work, has been done on Martha Graham's autobiography that indicates that while she is one of the voices as the author of it, there were others who contributed. So there are times when you might read, I did this, I said this, etc., and we can't always be clear whether Graham actually wrote that or not. So that's an added level of complication. I should say, though, that Janet Elber, who's the artistic director of the company, is a former Graham dancer, danced many of these roles herself. So I think she, in her selecting what to include, would be choosing a verbal commentary that fit with her sense of what was going on in the dance and her memories of being directed by Graham, who was still active in the company even after she stopped dancing, telling her, this is what you should do, this is what's going on with the characters. So I think in a weird sort of way, the annotator, Elber, is in a sense the annotator. She's making the selections from Graham, but also incorporating her own dance and now artistic director elements. And I should say, if I'm not mistaken, I think at this point, the Graham Company is the oldest dance company in the United States and probably in the world. And one of the ways they've managed to survive is that after Graham died, which is the point at which many companies disappear, immediately or a few years later, they have kept her work ongoing, but brought in other choreographers to present. And they have even taken dances from the repertory and reworked them. So there might be, a montage going on in the background of different versions of the dance while it's being danced. So I think Elber really has brought, back to reception issues, an amazing creativity to her position as artistic director to keep intact the legacy of Martha Graham's dances, but allow the dances to develop and change over time in order to keep them alive for new audiences.
But with that fluidity, which seems perhaps particularly useful for dance.
Yeah.
Another question for you from Laura, but reflecting on some of the issues that Laura brought up with gerontology and aging. Do you engage in this study with the appeal of females in traditional tales for aging female artists and so forth in these post-classical tales?
I'm sorry, the aging meaning Martha Graham's aging? I'm not quite
Martha
sure.
Graham's aging, the use of Jocasta as a character who is not a young ingenue dancer, at least based on that clip, and I would presume in general when performed and so forth.
Yeah, that clip actually does not have Graham dancing in it. Age is a complicating factor, and I found Laura's comments about women growing old and dementia fascinating. Graham danced into her 60s, I believe it is. Very late for a dancer. Some think she should have stopped dancing before then. As you know, as Graham grew older, she kept dancing a number of her roles, but then turned them over to younger people. So I guess it is a factor, but it's one of the things that also changes over time, and different people bring, you know, a different perspective, look, whatever, to a different role.
But it's interesting that thinking that there aren't a lot of famous dances that I can think of besides these, some of Graham's, that focus on older women rather than younger and so forth.
I see what you're saying. Yes, and you have, you know, let's say Medea in Cave of the Heart, or you have Jocasta here. Yes, these, if not old, they're certainly mature female figures, and very much Graham choreographed for herself. So in terms of some of the feminist impulses in her dancing, you know, I can't say that they weren't there consciously, and some of them in some form probably were, but she was also a dancer and a choreographer and wanted to create roles for herself. So she is doing certain things in the 1940s that are not necessarily being done in other art forms much in terms of women-centered projects until the 70s. And, you know, that step in the history of women's movement. So I think she anticipated a lot of things that were developed later, even if it came from a desire to be literally center stage.
That makes sense, and that the personal effect matters. I'll leave a couple of minutes left. If you have any last questions, please put them in the chat. Laura, I did have one question back to you. And thinking about that issue of age, and you're thinking of this as queering Aristophanes' wasps. What's the effect of expanding the notion of queerness to cover people who were themselves in positions of high power in Athenian society? So the characters, although very much not the actors and so forth, are older male citizens, and they are temporarily or potentially disempowered by age, but it's not a fixed identity to that extent. It's an identity that has come upon them. And how does that work with sort of notions of queerness there?
Well, I addressed this a little bit toward the end of the paper. So if you look at modern concepts of heterohappiness, that aging as it's represented in the 21st century US and Europe is supposed to be heterohappiness, that it focuses on heterosexual coupledom and happy intimacies, as the term is, with descendants, then Aristophanes' wasp says, no, that is not what aging is for Philocleon or the adult jurors. Aging is about homosociality. It's about your age mates. There are in the Greek the constant use of syndikastai, that either fellow jurors. And so this notion of we serve together as comrades in arms during these campaigns, and now we serve together every morning, that we go to stand for being put on juries, that we are part of the pool, and that we are going to convict people, and that is where our power is. If our power was punishing Persians in the past, it is now punishing particularly people who have more money than us who come up for trial. And if we are also doing a favor then to Cleon, that's wonderful too, but that is the harder thing for Philocleon to see when his son says, but you are a tool of this more powerful elite man in your society. So I talk about how that it presents a different picture of aging that doesn't accord with that 21st century image that is used in, say, advertisements for nursing homes in Europe or in the US. And I also examine the other thing that I did with this production, but I wasn't able to talk with this paper, was I was really curious about queer coding that was going on in English translations of Aristophanes' wasps over the course of the 20th century. And that in my translation, I was trying to take the queer coding out because it focuses on a problem with finding in English a word to tease someone about sexual practices without necessarily saying those sexual practices are deviant. And that what is typically happened in the 21st century, it becomes a sign of deviant male sexuality, and that over the course of the century, the terms change, but they all focus on that. It's particularly in a scene with a character called the son of Kereas. And that I wondered if there was a way to represent these words differently in the text. So I didn't like what I perceived was queer coding and wanted to change that and to make it more about a perception of age differences between the older jurors, Philocleon and the members of the chorus, perceiving this younger man as having, we might say, chutzpah, or throwing his weight around, but not, and so they find fault with him. But I think the translations, or what I was upset about the translations, they seem to add something in there that I didn't think was in the Greek, which is that then they were saying the problem with this young man is he's also sexually deviant. And I don't think that's what's happening.
So it's fascinating. And you might, if you don't know it already, connecting this to other panels at this conference, there's in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they do a brief production of Aristophanes' wasps, which definitely leads into that traditional queer coding there and so forth, and uses it to attack Cleon. So all of these weaving together. And speaking of weaving together, for those of you interested in specifically this notion of streaming and pedagogy and communicating with larger audiences, tonight from 6 to 7 p.m., there's a special demonstration and discussion of Greek and Roman food, YouTube, and the classroom, hosted by Jessica Romney. So that's 6 to 7. Coming up next, 4:30 to 5:30, is another research panel on reimagining remains of the past, on, again, computer games, images of archaeology and ruins. So stay tuned for those. Let's give a thank you to all of our awesome panelists and look forward to the rest of the conference.